This show is easily the most unnecessary series ever created for Star Wars. It's telling the backstory of a backstory that originated from less than 3 lines of dialogue in the original Star Wars movie. This series is slow, it's boring, it's obviously just another lazy cash grab by Disney. On top of that, it's crammed full of woke garbage that has no subtlety whatsoever. And of course, this series is trying to tell the history of a character that no one cares about. And to make it worse, we've already seen where this character's story will end, so who really cares? This makes it difficult to feel any sense of tension or concern no matter what happens. If he gets captured, we know he will escape. If he's in some sort of fight, we know he's going to win. Why would I bother trying to be invested in this character at all? On the plus side, I've already seen the first couple episodes, and there hasn't been a single second of Tatooine! Thank goodness for small miracles, I suppose, but it still doesn't change the fact Andor is bad, Episode 1. Now, it's not my fault that the show is garbage, but I do try to be fair, and in that case, let's start with some of the good stuff about the show. Even though there's a tremendous amount of CGI in this series, there also seems to be quite a bit of real set pieces, and credit where it's due, the building and locations look quite good. All of these locations feel authentic and immersive to the Star Wars universe. So, congrats!
I like it a lot.
And as I already mentioned, it's nice to see some places other than Tatooine, because for whatever reason, Disney seems to think that there's only 10 planets in the entire galaxy, and Tatooine happens to be 9 of them. I also think the flashback scenes were handled quite well. They tend to be very brief and show just enough to get the point across. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot else that I can say that's good about this series. In contrast, there are quite a few things that are bad, and we're gonna get to all of it.
That's very disappointing.
There's the pacing, which moves along slower than a snail. Then you have half the actors who sound like they're mumbling all of their lines. Brr, brr, brr. I have to turn on the subtitles just to understand what they're talking about.
Understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
And then the story itself is quite boring, and the episodes are absolutely crammed full of extra padded filler. Without exaggeration, the first 3 episodes of this series could easily have been reduced down to a single 30-minute episode. That's how bad it is. I've mentioned this numerous times in other videos, but this is a reoccurring habit with Disney, whether it's Marvel or Star Wars. They deliberately stretch out their episodes as much as they possibly can in order to get extra episodes and lengthen the overall season to make it seem like it is much bigger than it really is.
It is, and you got a big one too.
For example, while the establishing shots in the series can be quite good, the problem is that it happens constantly. How many times do they need to make the camera move very slowly and pan across the environment or across the room? It drags everything down so the episode feels like it's stuck in the mud. I don't think it's all that necessary to repeatedly show a character very slowly walking through an environment for almost 2 minutes.
What a story.
And then, of course, we have the extremely large animal in the room, which for once is not a feminist. Instead, it happens to be the elephant in the room, which is that the writers have decided to cram a bunch of woke nonsense into this series, and it is about as subtle as a jackhammer. I'll end up covering that more as we get to those parts in the series, but for now, there's a few things that you should keep in mind. Firstly, the writers have said that the entire story is supposed to be about how Donald Trump is a bad person, as if we hadn't had enough of the nauseating Orange Man bad garbage.
Oh, not this again.
There also seems to be a character that's a stand-in for him, but what's more ridiculous is that the writers have said that they specifically want to address the situation with Orange Man Bad, and the fact that he took away people's rights.
You really believe that? How pathetic.
But of course, if you actually were to ask one of these idiotic writers which of their rights specifically had been removed, they wouldn't be able to give you an answer, because it never happened. Already in the first couple episodes, we see the characters dealing with things like immigration and borders. In other words, it's a bunch of garbage that people would not actually want to see in a Star Wars show. Also, one of the main actresses on the series had been giving interviews and talked about how much the show was going to center around gender politics. Isn't that wonderful? And lastly, the writers on the series have stated that they will deliberately change existing lore and canon because they just felt like it.
This is terrible.
So, when you take all of that and combine it with a show that is incredibly boring, you're left with something that is not exactly what you would call enjoyable. The episode opens following the character Andor as he's walking down a long bridge. Although it's almost entirely CGI, it's still visually quite impressive. It's gloomy, it's rainy, and it does a good job of setting the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the rest of the episode is going to ruin that. We learn that this planet is called Morlana 1, and that this is happening 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, which is when the first Death Star was destroyed. Andor continues walking into the city, and to my surprise, it actually looks like a place that would exist within Star Wars. So far, everything seems to be going well. But don't worry, it gets worse. Andor arrives at a business that at first I thought might have been a bar, but actually turns out to be a brothel.
Your mother was a dumb whore with a fat ass. Did you know that?
He starts asking questions about a former employee from a group of people known as the Kenari. There happens to be two men sitting at a bar who immediately start trouble with Andor. This is going to set up a lot of the conflict in the next couple episodes, but I can't help but think how completely unoriginal this is. Not only has the angry guy at the bar trope been done a million times before, but it was also done in the first Star Wars movie. Some might call it nostalgia, I would call it lazy writing. Eventually, Andor explains to the hostess that he's looking for his sister, but the hostess doesn't know anything about where she left to, so Andor ends up leaving empty-handed. He heads outside, and this is where the over-reliance on CGI fails. While it was slightly raining earlier, it is now a much stronger downpour, but the problem with this is that for some reason not a single drop of rain seems to land on Andor's head. It's kinda obvious, and it looks dumb. After all, it seems a bit ridiculous that the show can spend millions of dollars on CGI, but can't spend $10 on a garden hose. The two men from the bar eventually catch up with Andor, and it turns out that they work as some sort of security, pseudo-police thing, and they demand that he stop. The two of them decide to shake him down. Andor seems to go along with it, and he says that he has 300 credits in his pocket. He allows the two men to get close, and when they do, he strikes one with a headbutt, and the other is thrown to the ground and disarmed. When they go to check on the first guy, they find that somehow he's dead, which seems kind of ridiculous. The only injury he got was a single headbutt from Andor. Even if he had struck his head on the ground after falling, it seems extraordinarily unlikely that he would have died from this. At most, he would have had a minor concussion, but the show needs to increase the tension, so apparently he's just dead.
The spark of his life is smothered in shite.
The other guard gets pretty scared and tries to convince Andor that there is a way out of it and they can just pretend that it was an accident. If they go in together, neither of them will get into trouble. It's pretty obvious that the guy is lying and he's going to double-cross Andor, so Andor just shoots him with the blaster and takes off. Little bit of a side note here, I've seen people and even other YouTubers criticizing this scene, saying how Andor is supposed to be a hero and yet he murders both of these men. Except that's a bunch of bullshit. These men were trying to shake down Andor. They were robbing them, and one of them held a blaster right up against Andor's head. Both of them were the aggressors. Andor was merely defending himself. Even though the death of the first man was a 1 in a billion fluke from a headbutt, even killing the second man was still entirely 100% justified. It doesn't matter that he was disarmed, and it doesn't matter that the fight was over. He was still the aggressor. He was still the person in the wrong. He was absolutely going to continue going after Andor, very likely with the help of more security. He was very much still a threat. Also, keep in mind that during the shakedown, this guy fired his blaster at Andor's head. He had already attempted to kill Andor. His death was an appropriate punishment for his crimes.
You don't approve? Well, too bad.
There are a lot of stupid things about this series that make it bad, but this is not one of them. Andor makes it back to his ship and leaves the planet. The next scene takes place on a different planet known as Ferrix, where we see a droid that looks like it was specifically designed to resemble a, yeah.
That looks just like an enormous
Wang!
I'm sure at least one of the writers thought it was hilarious. Regardless, in the opening of this episode, the camera slowly followed the character of Andor as walking through a city. This was fine because it was the introduction to the series. Unfortunately, the show creators decided that it was so good that they needed to do it again. We spend the next 2 minutes watching this droid slowly make its way through the area. This is what I was referring to when I said that the show is needlessly padded to extend the length. Then it switches over into a flashback where we see a younger version of Andor and his sister, and we get an introduction to the Kenari people. It turns out that they're a bunch of stupid primitive savages who fight with sticks and live in mud huts.
The next one of you primates even touches me.
This by itself is not anything to get worked up about. There are countless different types of people throughout the galaxy, and certainly not all of them are going to be at the level of technology that allows for space travel. But don't worry, it gets worse. You see, there's more to consider about the Kenari people. Remember when I said the writers intended to make this series all about Orange Man bad and the things related to him? Well, one of those things happens to be illegal immigrants. This is why all of the Kenari people are brown.
You fucking racist.
Why is this important? Because the Kenari people are meant to quite literally be a one-to-one representation of people from Central and South America, whereas the Empire is meant to represent the United States of America. Later on, we're even going to see how the Kenari will sneak across borders because the writers are about as subtle as a jackhammer. Simply put, the show creators have made it so that the Kenari are basically space Mexicans.
Now we'll build a projection machine.
And this is where we get some delicious irony. Woke weirdos like the writers on this series are completely oblivious to the fact that they are the most racist people on the planet. They genuinely believe that they're doing something good and bringing light to the misfortune of the brown people. However, in doing so, they depict the space Mexicans as being stupid primitive savages who fight with sticks and live in mud huts.
This isn't racist at all, by the way.
For those of you in my audience who may have some Hispanic heritage, let me ask you something. When the show creators believe an accurate representation of you and your family involves depicting you as helpless, stupid, primitive savages who fight with sticks and live in mud huts, how does that make you feel?
I hate this. It is revolting.
Do you enjoy being depicted like that? Because I'm willing to bet you probably don't. And that's the funny part about all this, because the woke weirdos don't even realize what they're doing and why it's wrong. And on that topic, there's another ridiculous thing I need to point out. The character of Andor himself is essentially just a Hispanic version of Han Solo, except of course Andor is better and browner. Basically, they made him into Juan Solo.
I am insulted on your behalf.
Getting back to the story that's still in the flashback, Juan Solo and the rest of the space Mexicans get startled when a ship crash lands on the planet, but then it immediately cuts back to the present day. Juan Solo is woken up by the Pen 15 droid and is concerned about the events of the previous night. He doesn't know if he was tracked, so he's going to try to create an alibi. He tells the Pen 15 droid to lie, and the droid responds by saying it requires a lot of energy. And this seems like, to me, something that might pop up later in the series, where the droid is unable to lie because it has low energy and therefore it causes a problem for the characters or something. And while I do give them credit for trying to set this up, I also can't help but point out how unbelievably fucking stupid it is that it would require a significant amount of energy for the Pen 15 droid to lie. Do you remember how the last couple scenes were introduced with a camera slowly following a character through a city that takes about 2 minutes to finish? Well, guess what? It's happening again! And this time it's Juan Solo as he's going to meet one of his friends. After catching up with him, Juan Solo gives some long contrived story about what they did the previous night in order to create his alibi. His friend notices the injury on his face and adds more to the story to account for it. This scene is incredibly boring and takes about 10 times longer than it should have. When the show finally moves into the next scene, we're introduced to a few new characters. The station chief, who we only see during this scene, and this guy named Cyril Karn. The chief is reading a lengthy report about the incident that happened with the two men, but he wants to sweep it under the rug and pretend that it was just an accident, despite knowing that there was some shady stuff going on. He does this because he wants to make his command look good to the Empire, so he figures it's better to just pretend that it didn't happen or that it was some sort of accident. However, Karn refuses to let it go. He seems to be a little naive or ignorant about the shady stuff that's going on, and only sees it as two of their men who were murdered, and the culprit needs to be found and brought to justice. This event was so important to him that he never went to sleep, and he spent all night creating an extremely detailed report that the station chief simply ignored. From this we can learn a few things about Karn. First, he is a diligent and dedicated worker. Second, he views justice as more important than appearances. And third, he prioritizes the men of his command above himself. These are all virtuous and highly admirable traits, but it seems that the show creators are too stupid to understand this, as over the next couple episodes, they're going to try to depict these traits as being bad.
That don't make no sense!
Also, I should point out that Karn seems to be a stand-in for Orange Man Bad. The writers want to portray him as a villain because he's going after Juan Solo, but the reality is that he's an officer determined to track down someone who he believes is a murderer, because while Juan Solo was justified in his actions, Karn doesn't know that. Switching scenes, we get yet another incredibly long, slow, and unnecessary introduction to another character named Bix. She appears to be some sort of mechanic and is a longtime friend of Juan Solo. He needs to sell some valuable Empire technology, so he needs her to contact a buyer, which she reluctantly agrees to. We get a brief introduction to her white boyfriend, who appears to be some sort of jealous asshole.
Note the lack of surprise.
It's important to note that while Bix is not a member of the Canary people, her skin is the same kind of brown. And I'm pointing out the color of these characters because the writers are extremely obvious about their agenda. Putting it simply, any character in this show that happens to be brown is going to be good, and any character that is white is either going to be bad or is going to be subservient to another character that happens to be brown.
That's racist.
Yes, it's that simple, and yes, it's that fucking stupid. Continuing, we get another flashback of the Space Mexicans as they're preparing to go and investigate the crash site. Juan Solo decides to go, and apparently this is his first time. The group is led by a female warrior because it's current year and fucking of course. We also learn that Juan Solo seems to have a bit of a crush on the lead warrior girl. Something interesting about these flashbacks is that we have no idea what any of these characters are saying. The language is Canary, but we're not given any subtitles for it. We as the audience simply need to figure it out. This means that everything being told in these flashbacks is done from a method of show, not tell, which is exactly what should always be happening and something that the Disney writers often fail to do. However, I find it strange that the writers on this show managed to do this one element of storytelling quite well, while at the same time failing at everything else.
Boom. Roasted.
Back in the present, Karn is still conducting his investigation, and he goes to talk with the radar techs. He wants to know if there were any ships that arrived or left the planet around the time of the incident. They managed to find one that doesn't have proper identification, subtle as a jackhammer. Then he remarks about how an unknown foreign ship is able to casually cross the border and land on the planet. Again, subtle as a fucking jackhammer.
It is a tale told by an idiot.
He follows this up by giving orders to put out the word that they're looking for a space Mexican. Some of the other employees don't really want to bother with it, and they seem to be concerned that it would stir up trouble in the neighboring systems, but Karn insists that it must be done because they're looking for a murderer, and they need to do their jobs. Once again, it seems like the show creators are trying to paint him as a bad guy when everything he's doing is actually correct. In the next scene, we see Juan Solo at a shipyard removing the flight history on the ship that he used the other day. We're introduced to some other random character that works at the shipyard and two very stupid-looking CGI dog things. The guy tells Juan Solo that he's angry with him and that he can't use the ship anymore, and all of this takes way longer than it should have, but the purpose of this scene is to establish the fact that Juan Solo no longer has a ship that he can use to leave the planet. There's one more final flashback where Juan and the other space Mexicans are finally leaving their village to go and explore, and that's where the episode ends. On one hand, the first episode did a good job of raising some questions. On the other hand, it was slow, boring, and padded with so much unnecessary useless filler that I have absolutely no interest in finding the answer to any of those questions. There's a major problem that all the Disney writers have. They seem to think that taking 2 minutes worth of content and stretching it out to 20 minutes somehow makes it better. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. The slow, establishing shot at the beginning of the episode looked really good, and that worked, but you know what doesn't work? Doing the same thing 5 more times during the episode. I've already watched the next 2 episodes, and I can tell you right now, this show doesn't get any better. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 1.
I'm taking shots at the enemy. I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy. If I got something to say, you better let me speak. Turn it up a new degree, bitch, you ain't seen anything. I pop off with the new